Welcome to Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff. Today's show is all about the art world. With us today are two people from the American Folk Art Museum, the director and CEO, Jason Busch, and then senior curator, Valerie Rousseau. Jason and Valerie, welcome and thank you for joining us. Jason, I want to start with you because folk art, what exactly is folk art? Can you tell our viewers?
Well, thank you, Jean. It's wonderful to be with you today. And that's a good question. What is folk art, which is an ever-changing field? For us, we're really in the center of it. And we embrace names like folk art and outsider art and art brut as ways to look at self-taught art. So what we really do at the American Folk Art Museum is to celebrate the accomplishments of those individuals whose learning and creativity comes from within rather than through academic training.
So in other words, if I didn't go to art school, I could call myself someone, if I paint, then I'm
a self-taught artist.
A self-taught artist,
yeah.
and that would be considered folk art?
Well, yes. Certainly the terminology has changed over time, and when we were established in 1961, the word folk art was used in many ways to describe centuries worth of folk art. But my colleague Valerie also works so much with artists of the 20th and 21st century. You may want to say something more about terminology.
Indeed, when the museum was founded in 1961, the term folk art was very much a term used by networks of collectors in the U.S. And term
was that to mean American folk art or what exactly?
Yes, so I would say like the term from the beginning embrace the works made by self-taught artists from the 18th century up to the present. So the museum from the beginning always embraced all cultures, works created nationally, locally, but also internationally. Of course, during the first years of the foundation of the museums, the focus was really on American historical folk art. And over time, there were networks of collectors, of audiences asking to see what is created in the present time. And it's the reason why now we are seeing like an explosion of interest in the field of self-taught art that is made in the present time.
Well, and I think what Valerie said captivates us so much because, and it encapsulates what is the field of folk art today. You know, for us as a museum, we have a collection of over 8,000 works of art, and they represent the self-taught genius of nearly every continent. So when you hear the name American Folk Art Museum, you first think about art made in this country.
That's right.
Which is true, and it's very important to the history of American art, what we do at the American Folk Art Museum. But based in New York City, which is a crossroads for the world, we're able to really reflect all of the experiences and traditions and cultures that artists bring to their work, as Valerie said, from the 18th century to the present.
Yes, when I think of folk art, I think of Grandma Moses, and then I think of quilts and all sorts of crafts. And I think most people think that way, but I think what you're saying is that it encompasses a much broader scope than that. And international folk art is called, did you say brut art or?
Art brut. Well, really the field of Valerie Rousseau, so I'll let her talk in more detail.
It's interesting because it connects with the history of the Hamptons somehow. The term art brut, like champagne brut, B-R-U-T, that can be translated by a raw, was a term coined in 1945 by a famous French artist, Jean Dubuffet. Jean Dubuffet built a collection from the 1945 up to his death in 1985. And he gathered works created by marginals, by outsiders, patients from psychiatric hospitals. He called them also people from, he called them the common man, works from the common man. So people who were janitor, mechanics, teachers. So all works created by untrained or non-professional artists. And what happened at the end of the 40s, he met Alfonso Osorio, who is a well-known collector and an artist who lived in the Hamptons, in East Hampton. He had a beautiful mansion that was called the Creeks. And in the 50s, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner were visitors and friends of Osorio. And what happened, Osorio brought the collection of Jean Dubuffet in the Hamptons, and 1,200 works stayed there for 10 years. And it means like the art world in the 50s and 60s have seen all these works in the mansion of Osorio.
Well, you just mentioned a lot of wonderful artists, local artists here in the Hamptons, and then Dubuffet, who I just love his work. So recently, you received a very big gift from Audrey Heckler. I understand this is an international collection of folk art, and I believe it was just announced at the end of September. And can you tell us a little bit about that collection? And then I want to ask you about some of your other collections and art, but tell us what she did for you.
Sure. Well, certainly the gift of Audrey Heckler was a team effort, and I'll begin to answer, but I certainly want to hear from our colleague as well. Audrey has been a long time and esteemed trustee of our museum, and she, decades ago, started collecting international self-taught art, beginning with that was made in the United States and then expanding beyond. And she created a world-class collection, and all the while thinking about how the museum's collection was growing as well. Over the years, my colleagues, both those who were at the museum and those who've moved on, have helped to cultivate the collection, no more so than Valerie Rousseau, who published this wonderful book, The Hidden Art, in 2017.
Can we see the book?
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. And so this is her collection?
It is. And then, Valerie, why don't you chat about the exhibition?
So what we present in 2019 was a great selection, a representative sample of her collection. What is so important and fundamental about Audrey's vision? First of all, she has a wonderful eye. She's someone who listened to a lot of her friend dealers and collectors, but she really has a personal approach to the works. She will always collect the works that she loves. And what is wonderful about her collection, that it really exemplifies the field of folk art and self-taught art in the US and abroad. So she has a diversity of wonderful works from African American artists. She has art brut artists as collected by Jean Dubuffet. She has work by American masters like Edmondson and Bill Traylor, who are famous now, to new discoveries. And when I say new discoveries, artists who have been discovered in the world, coming from Japan, from India, from Europe in general. So this is really like encompasses like the development of the field.
Well, congratulations on this new acquisition. And Audrey Heckler, if you're watching this show, I just want to thank you, because what you've done is so instrumental for people across the world. When they come into the museum in the future, they will see your collection, and you will bring great happiness not only to people living now, but for people who will live years and years to come. And on that note, another major donor at your museum is a good friend of mine. Her name is Joyce Cowan. And I met Joyce on a different charity, through a different charity. We served on the same board. And I understand she's been instrumental in propelling the museum forward. Can you tell us a little bit, if you don't want to go into too much detail about Joyce's gift, but can you tell our audience, Jason, what it means to an institution such as yours when a major donor gives a gift? I would imagine it's the difference between just going along and then versus becoming massive.
Well, these are great questions, Jean. And it's just, I smile and I'm warmed by hearing the names of Audrey Heckler and Joyce Berger Cowan, because they are two individuals who have done so much for our museum. You know, both of whom have been transformative in their generosity, transformative to our institution. Joyce, who is also a longtime trustee of our museum and has been involved and so graciously took up that mantle when her husband Daniel was a trustee and passed away several decades ago. Hands down, there's no other individual in the 60-year history of the American Folk Art Museum who has done more financially for our institution than Joyce Cowan. We wouldn't be a museum without Joyce. And
she's a wonderful woman.
And Joyce is, and she's very candid about this. She's over 90 years of age.
Right.
She is one of the most inquisitive enthusiasts of folk art whom I've ever met. She was on my first interview as director, and I miss not seeing her every Wednesday for a jazz program that she sponsors at the museum, but we talk often. In fact, I talked with her today. And Joyce, about 10 years ago, wanted to really invest in our museum location at Lincoln Square in Manhattan, which is one of our 2 locations. Our other is in Long Island City, Queens. And we have now been at our Lincoln Square location for 30 years, and that's thanks to Joyce. Because she said about 10 years ago, let's invest in this museum here in this location, and was able to bring forth a series of exhibitions that really paved the way for shows like the Memory Palaces exhibition that Valerie was just bringing up. And you know, Joyce's interests have so much been with historic American folk art, which I greatly appreciate, because that is, as Valerie said, where the foundation of our museum was in the 1960s, in celebrating work that had been overlooked. You know, that by individual or anonymous artists, useful furniture and ceramics, some by some of the most well-known names today like M.I. Phillips or Edward Hicks, who's known for doing his great paintings of the Peaceable Kingdom. And we provided a platform for them when other institutions that focused on the fine arts and academically trained artists might have sidelined some of these artists. And what we now trace in our museum is a continuity of self-taught art from the 18th century all the way to the present, where, as Valerie was talking about, artists of today and of the last 50 years who also were marginalized because they were imprisoned or were hospitalized, and their work was never seen on a platform, and we provided that.
I think what you do is so important to so many different artists. And then education. Now, I would imagine during non-COVID times, you would have a steady stream of students coming into the museum. And before you tell me about that, I want to hear a little bit about what you're doing during this pandemic.
Sure.
To provide still a platform and then a way for people to experience all you have in the American Folk Art Museum. I assume you've gone virtual. Is that correct?
We have. And you know, Jean, 7 months ago, I didn't know what Zoom was. And I must say, I've become
I think a lot of us didn't.
I've become quite experienced with it, but we've been, you know, to answer your question, we have been able to weather this storm of the pandemic fairly well, and we're honored by that. We've received hundreds of thousands of dollars from foundations, individuals, and the government to be able to fund things like virtual programming. And while we did very little of it before, and 7 months ago I would have said anything we do virtually, anything we do on social media, anything we do on our website is to drive physical attendance to our museum in Manhattan. I don't stand by those words anymore, because how we are evaluating our visitor engagement is so much more online now. We're attracting thousands of individuals across the globe, from Canada to Bangladesh to Australia, who have an interest in our museum but might not ever have an opportunity to come to New York City. And so they're learning online through what we show in webinars and collection tours and activating that 8,000 work collection of ours.
And I think it's so important. And for our viewers, we are with Jason Busch and Valerie Rousseau of the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. And we are getting a little lesson about folk art. And we are also learning about how they've been able to reach out to the entire world during this pandemic and to make what they can offer available to everyone. Now, you have an event coming up to fundraise, correct?
We do.
But before I I hear about that, I want to go back to the misconceptions about folk art, because there are quite a few. And what is the number one misconception?
I would love to hear Valerie's thoughts as well on this. I will share that I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that folk art is not well thought. While it's anything but that, it is deeply intellectual and it is deeply emotional. It is not naive, but rather because of the fact that the inspiration of the art itself comes from those who use their own resources, who are using their own creativity. In some cases, especially when we get to the 20th and 21st century, are doing their work to survive in life. There's something very visceral about it. But
yeah, indeed, to pursue on this idea, I think that self-taught art is not a privilege. Being an artist, a creator, it's a need. And I think that we have gathered these expressions, these different manifestations and practices over the last 60 years by supporting often creators that were marginalized from the art mainstream. So the misconception is that folk art or self-taught art doesn't exist anymore, and it's not true. It's a very active field, ongoing and timeless. The need for expression and creativity is not something that is going to disappear. And our collection is a collection of treasures because we have an advocacy. I would say our museum always been trying to look far ahead, discover things that were maybe rejected from the norms. Jean Dubuffet and many other professional artists, and it speaks to the artsy auction. Artists, professional artists, have been the bigger supporters of these art forms. From the 19th century up to today, we have so many examples. And so this is an illustration that there's a deep connection in the art world between these artists.
What about COVID art now? Are you seeing a lot of folk art coming out of this period, or is it just beginning? Because I think when I think of this period, there's a lot that we've all experienced. Right. There's been a lot of suffering. And I think that we'll see a lot of folk art develop from the COVID-19 pandemic period that we are all living in right now. And has some started to trickle in, or not quite yet?
I think it's a good question in the fact that we have continued to engage all of our audiences to express themselves through learning tools that we can provide. So we actually started a community quilt project where, you know, the idea of a quilt is oftentimes one that is the gathering of many thoughts, many persons coming together to contribute to. And we've encouraged through a wonderful workshop exercise that somebody can do at home to actually do their own square to a quilt and then to send those into the museum so that we can then make that into a virtual quilt that we may use actually on the wall of the museum at some point this fall or some point this coming winter.
Or whenever you open up.
Yeah, well, we have.
Oh, you don't need to open up to show that, but you can
right.
virtually you can show that. And what about programs or artists from all backgrounds? How do you promote diversity? I think it's so important right now, and our history here in our country has not particularly been a good one when it comes to diversity. It's been there's a lot that we're all uncomfortable about. Slavery, which was a horrible period in our country. And so what are you doing to promote diversity at the museum?
Well, it's a great question, and there's no better answer to what the American Folk Art Museum is doing right now than to come to our museum or to look on our website to see an exhibition that's been up since early February and will be up through the early part of January called American Perspectives, which is 4 centuries of American folk art from our own collection that looks at topics of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries that are so relevant today: anti-immigration, social injustice, racial inequality, economic uncertainty. All of that's reflected in objects of the past, so that what we can do is to provide an historical and cultural context. We can provide a foundation and answers and inspiration to individuals who come into our museum today. And that's what I, as director, want to provide to all of our guests, is to come into the museum and to be inspired by the work, to either be their own artist, as we were talking about earlier, or to appreciate something that would have been sidelined or forgotten in the past. And we do have the privilege in being able to focus on self-taught art across time and place, and we are very honored to have that role. There really is no other museum in the world that is doing what we're doing with the caliber of scholarship, talent of staff, and depth and quality of collection and exhibitions that we're producing.
And this is really so wonderful to hear. Now, you have an upcoming auction, is it, that you're putting online with a lot of works? And when is that happening? And then can you tell our viewers a little bit about how they might be able to get involved, and then if someone can't get involved, how they can give to the museum?
All questions I love, Jean. Thank you. And I'll get to all of them. I will say the Artsy auction, which Valerie and I have been talking about.
What a cute name.
Well, it's
Artsy
a new
auction.
It's a new Artsy. Artsy is it's a new endeavor for us, and Artsy, the online auction. Sort of really the auction place, where many of our collectors and others throughout the world are looking to acquire art. And of course, you don't need to be a collector to buy art online, but that is the future of it. And so, like many museums, we have pivoted. Where normally we would have had a gala in the fall, what we've decided instead is to organize an auction with our partner Artsy, and we've been able to engage 100 artists. As Valerie mentioned, artists who in many cases are very big names in the world today, from Polly Apfelbaum and Faith Ringgold, Laurie Simmons, Marcel Zama, our own trustee at the American Folk Art Museum Cause, all of whom, as Valerie had said, are inspired by self-taught art, have contributed their work, and we're going to sell that work. The proceeds will benefit the American Folk Art Museum. So you can go to artsy.com/folk art museum, and from October 8th through October 22nd, bid and bid often, because your bidding goes to the right place. It benefits the museum.
And did you actually get this art donated, or do you go out and buy it? How does this all work? In 1 minute or less, because we're running out of time.
Do you want to answer that? Or,
they are different.
It's a team effort.
Yeah, it's a team effort.
So in different ways, if an artist really needs the money, then you might go out and buy it. And then if someone wants to donate, I assume.
All of the artists have donated.
Oh,
all of the artists have donated.
Fantastic.
And they've donated through the team effort. This project was led at our museum by our Deputy Director and Chief Development Officer, Carly Klopfenstein, and Paul Laster, who is an independent curator in New York. And the two of them together were the brainchild to this exhibition, or to this auction. But it's all the artists who contributed so selflessly to the museum. It's so warming to see many of them who have had histories with our museum, who've given back in such a way. And we hope to, we certainly hope to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it's essential for our museum. You know, our museum, Jean, is free. Every hour that we're open, every day that we're open, we're free. There's never a surcharge, but there's a cost to free admission, and that's where we need our patrons to be able to.
Yes, and
to help.
If someone wanted to volunteer, we have just a few minutes left. Are you taking volunteers now during the pandemic, or?
Absolutely.
And what can people do at the museum if they want to volunteer?
Well, on-site volunteering is something we're not doing right now because of the COVID restrictions, but we do have a wonderful group of volunteers, and we're looking for more. If you go to our website, folkartmuseum.org, it's very intuitive to go through and to see opportunities for contributing, for donating, for becoming a member, and for volunteering.
Yes, and say I can't afford to buy a piece of art, but I wanted to make a gift. And what about the small gifts?
Oh, they matter so much.
Yes, and that's what I often tell the audience. No matter what you can give, collectively, they can make or break an institution such as the American Folk Art Museum. And again, what is the website for donations?
The folkartmuseum.org, and we'll take you right to our homepage, and from there you'll easily be able to see how you can support the museum.
And just one other question. You said you're open right now. How many people come into the museum at one time during this pandemic?
Well, we follow city and state mandates, so it's an intimate experience. Currently, with the 25% capacity, there are no more than 25 people in the American Folk Art Museum at any one time. So if you wanted that kind of intimate experience with the art, this is the time. Through timed entry, which is easy to do, you can come and visit.
So you make an appointment.
Well, you just go to our website, and from there it'll take you right through to a time ticket through Eventbrite. It's all free. Every museum in New York requires, in New York City requires time ticketing at the present time.
Right now, I think it's great. I think to be able to experience a museum when no one else is there or very few people there, it's like magical.
Right. It's your museum. It's your investment.
It's your own, and that's free for everybody. I love it.
Free for everyone.
Well, thank you for joining us. This concludes today's episode of Successful Philanthropy. I'm Jean Shafiroff, your host. I'll see you next week.
Hello, I'm Jason Busch, Director of the American Folk Art Museum. Over nearly 60 years, our museum has been a leader in celebrating the accomplishments of self-taught artists across time and place, whose inspiration is genuine and candid, often resulting from personal experience. We create meaningful experiences and authentic connections with art for our guests at all stages of their lives, offering inclusive opportunities for learning sometimes new and complex perspectives.
I signed up for Youth Art Connection because I wanted to learn more about the history of art, and I wanted to use my summer to learn something new.
To create anything, it comes from your heart, and art, it's like a second language.
I love making art and like drawing, and I learned a lot of new things in this museum.